Rawls, in a theory of justice, is going to give or attempt to give a liberal theory of social justice. And liberal here doesn't mean left as opposed to right, but liberal in the kind of political theory sense. He's going to give a liberal theory of social justice as opposed to a classical theory of social justice, which you would find in someone like Aristotle, or as we talked about earlier, in someone like Aquinas or Luigi Tapparelli, or in Catholic social teaching. There you'll find classical, if you will, conceptions of social justice. Rawls is giving us a liberal one. Okay, great. So how does he start doing this? How does he start building up to this? He starts by talking about the subject of social justice. That's the way he puts it. And to build up to this, he first talks about and kind of defines society, right? So we all live in a society. Everybody lives in a society. Think of a society in this way as something kind of like what we've been calling a political community. But okay, society. It says it's an association of persons who more or less follow rules that are aimed at their mutual advantage. This should call to mind, hopefully, Locke's view of the commonwealth of the political community, political society. We start these political societies, according to Locke, for the mutual preservation of property, basically. Life, liberty, health, property. Life, liberty, estate. Rawls is echoing that same idea. A society is a group of people who have come together for their mutual advantage. Yeah, something like that. It's an association of persons who more or less follow rules, right? Not everybody follows the rules. Some people act asocially, some people steal, some people assault other people, and so on, right? But most people don't. And so that's why he says it's an association of persons who more or less follow rules that are aimed at mutual advantage, right? So that's a society. People come together for their mutual advantage. And what he has in mind here is something like, we even saw this all the way back in Aristotle, right? If you're just an individual by yourself, you are going to be spending 18 hours a day trying to stave off death. I mean, it's going to be a pretty bleak and dire existence for you. If you get together with other people, however, and you start forming larger and larger groups, that allows for specialization, which allows for an expansion of productive capacity. And so when we get a lot of people together, right, we designate, I don't know how we choose, somebody volunteers to become the fisherman. And then that person just goes and fishes, and they catch, and they get really good at it, and they catch more fish than society would have caught if everyone were to be a fisherman, in addition to being a basket weaver, in addition to being a cobbler, in addition to being blah, 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 right? If everyone had to do everything, if there were no specialization, society as a whole, all the people as a whole would have fewer fish than if we all got together and just said, you, that one guy, you go fish, right? And likewise for other things, for making clothes, for farming, for everything, right? By allowing for specialization, we produce more than we otherwise could just on our own, right? And so we come together for that mutual advantage. Now, I've gone on at detail about this because it's important for the next step. Rawls thinks that in society, there is going to be a conflict and an identity of interests. The identity of interests is basically what I was just talking about. We all have the same interest in being a part of society. Namely, that by being a part of society, we can have a better life than if we were to live solely by ourselves, right? I can see that by being a part of society, I have way more stuff to enjoy and to edify myself with. And right, my life is way better than it would be if I were just a lone individual off in the wilderness. Yeah. So society makes possible a better life for everybody that's a part of it, a better life than they would have if they just lived alone outside of society. And so there's an identity of interest. We all have that very same interest, right? And that's why we like society. That's why we join it. An identity of interest. but there's also a conflict of interests in society. Why? Well, because people prefer to have a greater rather than a lesser share of the goods produced by social cooperation, right? So there's a larger amount of goods produced when we specialize, when we get together as a society. And if given the choice, right, other things equal, you can either have more or less of those advantages, of those goods. Well, everyone would opt for more, right? That's what Rawls is saying. And so that leads to kind of conflict because I want more, you want more, everybody wants more. Well, we can't all have more, right? Then there's not enough for that. And so there's a kind of conflict there. I want more, you want more, but those are mutually exclusive. We both can't be satisfied. Both of our desires can't be satisfied. So there's an identity and a conflict of interests in society. And this leads to a question. Well, how are we supposed to divide up this share of goods that's produced by social cooperation? And that, in many ways, is the guiding question of a theory of justice. In Rawls's view, the principles of social justice are principles for determining how the goods and advantages of social cooperation are to be distributed. They are principles for resolving that conflict, principles for rationally resolving in a way that should be satisfactory to all rational agents that conflict. Now, I put parentheses around social there. So I've been saying Rawls is going to give us this theory of this liberal theory of social justice. And he does, and he puts it that way. But more often than not, he drops the qualifier social, and he'll just talk about principles of justice. And I'm going to do the same thing. When Rawls is talking about justice, he's talking about social justice. He just doesn't always call it social justice. The title of the book, he calls it a theory of justice. It would be more accurately titled a theory of social justice, right? So whenever you see Rawls talking about justice, he's talking about social justice, unless he indicates otherwise, but he very rarely does, right? And so the idea is we're going to try to figure out what these principles of social justice are so we can figure out which division of these goods that we produce through social cooperation, which division is correct, appropriate, rational. Now, the way he begins talking about this, getting a little bit more refined, a little bit more detail, he talks about the subject of social justice. And the subject of social justice is the basic structure of society. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. The subject is social justice. Rawls is very aware that there are other ways of talking about justice. So, for instance, when we were reading Aristotle, his primary go-to for thinking about justice was to think about it as a virtue, as a kind of virtue. That is to say, as a kind of state of character. And when we're considering questions of justice, we're considering how your state of character and the actions that flow from it affect other people, right? And so just and justice and justness and everything like that for Aristotle, it all kind of came back to the individual, to their character, right? That was the focal point for Aristotle. For Rawls, by contrast, that's not the focal point. The focal point is what he calls the basic structure of society. The subject of justice for Aristotle is the individual. The subject of justice for Rawls is the basic structure of society, right? And so justice, that word applies in the first place, according to Rawls, to the basic structure of society. So Aristotle, his focal point is a person just. Rawls's focal point is a society just, right? Okay, so what exactly does he mean by basic structure of society? In his view, the basic structure of society is the way in which the major social institutions, which we're going to talk about in just a second, the way in which they distribute rights and goods, right? These goods that arise from social cooperation, which he here calls advantages, How are those goods distributed, right? So we get more wealth from social cooperation. There's just more wealth. How is that wealth distributed? The major social institutions determine how that wealth is distributed. That's what Rawls is saying. The major social institutions determine who has what rights. And so when we're concerned with social justice, what we're really concerned with is whether or not the basic structure of society conforms to social justice. We're concerned with whether or not our major social institutions distribute rights and goods in a just way, right? Is this division of rights just? This distribution of rights? Is this distribution of the goods that arise from social cooperation just? I'll give you a couple of examples in just a second of how this is working. But the important point now is that these social institutions, these major social institutions, according to Rawls, distribute rights and goods. And this is what I want to illustrate for you. So to do this, what I want to go into a little bit more detail about is what exactly the major social institutions are. According to Rawls, the major social institutions of any society are going to consist, first and foremost, in the constitution of that society, like like we have our constitution, right? That thing, or if you don't have a written document, what it effectively is. But okay, it's the constitution. But then also the principal economic and social arrangements. Well, what exactly are these things? Rawls again is very helpful. He goes into some details about our own society. So these are the major social institutions of our own society. So he mentions the legal protection of freedom of thought and liberty of conscience, right? So that's kind of woven into our justice system. It comes from the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It's not explicitly stated there, but whatever, it doesn't matter. It's part of our political constitution that freedom of thought and liberty of conscience is protected. If we had a different constitution, which is to say, if we had a different major social institution, we wouldn't have that right distributed to us. Yeah, that's kind of his idea. So because we have the particular political constitution we have, everyone is given or afforded a legal protection of freedom of thought. Right? That's Rawls's idea. So there's a social institution distributing a particular right or liberty. Also kind of peculiar to our society, right? One of the major social institutions in particular of our society, the competitive market. We have competitive markets. We'll talk about that more in just a second. A further major social institution that determines the division of advantages from social cooperation, whether or not we allow the means of production to be privately owned. We're going to talk about the means of production a lot when we get to Marx, because that's a kind of Marxist term of art. But what it means is something like the means of production, productive property, things like factories, right? Do we allow factories, productive property, to be privately owned? And in the United States, we do, of course. But other societies are different. They don't allow or haven't allowed for the means of production to be privately owned. So the USSR, for example, didn't allow productive property like that to be privately owned. It was all publicly owned or nationally owned, something like that. Right? And so it's peculiar to our society that we have that major social institution, private property and the means of production. The USSR had a different one, right? They had a different major social institution. But depending on which institution you have, well, that's going to determine who gets the money, where the money winds up, where the rights end up, right? That's Rawls' idea. And the last one he mentions is the monogamous family. That's a social arrangement that determines who is advantaged, right? It determines who is advantaged in particular ways. So for example, right, why would he include that, right? Just to give you an example of why he might include something like that. The monogamous family it's not necessarily something that's written in law and written down somewhere, and everybody, if you go to jail if you don't follow this or something like that, but there are societal expectations. And this is certainly, I think, more true back in Rawls's day, but it's certainly true in certain parts of our society today. The societal expectation was that bound up with the monogamous family was that the husband, father goes out to work, the mother, wife stays home, takes care of kids, takes care of the house, and so on. Well, that societal expectation, that institution, that major social institution, is going to determine, in part, how certain advantages that arise from social cooperation are distributed. And so in particular, what it does, or what it led to, is fewer, or less, I should say, less wealth, less income being distributed to women than to men. And the idea here would be something like, in as much as there's this expectation that women are supposed to stay home and look after children, they will be passed over for employment opportunities. You might they are more likely to run into employers or potential employers who would think, I'm not going to give you the job. I'd rather you, that's not a fit occupation for a woman. A woman is supposed to, whatever, right, stay at home and watch kids and so on. Well, that means that her economic prospects are diminished relative to the husband fathers, right? And so the basic point that I'd be trying to make is simply that the societal expectations revolving around family life, around that major social institution, determine how things like wealth and income are distributed to particular people. That's the point that Rawls would make, and that I'm trying to make on Rawls's behalf, right? That's the idea. So that's why the monogamous family counts as a major social institution. For what it's worth, Rawls doesn't talk about it really much at all in A Theory of Justice, and people have criticized him for this, but we're not going to worry about it. All right, so let's give a further example. Let's look at competitive markets. We're going to compare a competitive market to a monopolistic market. And the idea here, what I'm trying to illustrate for you, is the way in which the way in which the major social institutions determine how money, wealth, income is distributed, right? The major social institution determines the distribution of, in this case, wealth. So the competitive market, that's the major social institution that we have, but we could have a different kind of society. We could have monopolistic markets. So competitive markets are markets where there are multiple sellers of some good or service. So if I am a clothes maker, I've got my clothes making firm, and there are other clothes making firms. Let's say I just make shirts just to make it easy. Right? In a competitive market, I can't just charge whatever price I want. If I wanted to charge $200 for my shirt, well, then my competitor might just come and say, well, I'll charge $175, right? And then he'll get all the customers and I'll go out of business. And so then I might say, well, I'll charge 150. And then, right, and the prices kind of race to the bottom, right? Something like that. Or at least they're lower than they otherwise would be. That's how competitive markets work. A monopolistic market, by contrast, is a market in which there is one seller of a good. So, depending upon what kind of situation we're in, we're going to have a different division of money, Rawls would say. So let's say we're in a competitive market. Let's say in our society, we're going to look at three different classes of people. We're going to look at your kind of upper class, super rich tycoon business CEO types. Right? I didn't mean to make him so he looks kind of evil. I didn't mean to make him look that evil, but whatever, he does. We also have middle class people. Not to reveal too much information about myself, but I'm not oil tycoon or anything like that. Don't come from money, but I make enough, and I can afford to have a nice little chair there and read my news, and that's what middle class people do. And okay, fine. So I'm the middle class representative. And then lastly, you might have people who aren't as well off as that, and the kind of lower socioeconomic class, right? Workers, the working class, factory workers, things like that. Okay, fine. how does a competitive so if we have a competitive market, what does that mean for these three different classes, socioeconomic classes of people? Well, when we allow for competitive markets, your rich people, right, and the upper classes, your CEOs, as we all know, right, they make a lot of money, and so that guy's got a lot of money. But in a competitive market, right, if we allow for something like a competitive market, I'm still gonna, the middle class people, they still do okay, right? They get the lower prices, they get the benefits of that competition between the sellers and so on, and so they can get cheaper goods, and they're doing all right. And then people below them in the lower socioeconomic class, yeah, they're not doing as well, but they still have a little bit of money at least, right? And so, okay, so that's the distribution you get. It's unequal, but you get something like that in a competitive market. Now let's consider those same three classes, but with a monopolistic market. And so now our CEO capitalist guy with a monocle can charge just exorbitant prices. And especially if it's a necessary good, such as clothing, people need it, right? People are going to pay for it, right? And let's say he's the only seller of shirts. Well, everybody needs a shirt. And so that guy is just going to be raking in the money in a monopolistic market if he's the only seller of goods, right? He's just going to be loaded with money. Me in the middle class, I'm not going to have as much money as I had in a competitive market because I got to spend so much of my money. I got to spend, 3/4 of my salary from Loyola just on this shirt or whatever, right? And so I just got pocket change left. Well, not quite, right? I got like $60 or whatever. The working class person, they're the ones really getting stiff. They just have pocket change left, right? So depending upon the kind of market we have, well, that determines how money is going to be distributed. And Rawls's question, what he's concerned with, is which of these distributions of money is just? And of course, these aren't the only ones. There are other alternatives you could think of. And so add all your other alternatives. Which of them is just? Which distribution is just? Which major social institution should we strive to have in our society? Rawls's answer, whichever one most closely accords with the principles of social justice, right? You might like the competitive market over the monopolistic market, but what good reason is there for preferring it? What good reason is for thinking that the competitive market, at least in comparison to the monopolistic market, is more just? Well, the money is distributed more evenly. Well, why does justice require that? Right? That's what Rawls is trying to address. And he thinks we need principles of social justice to really answer that kind of question. And so what he's going to try to give us in a theory of justice are the appropriate, rationally grounded, legitimate principles of social justice so we can figure out how our society should work. Should we have competitive markets or should we have monopolistic markets, right? That's what Rawls is trying to do. We can answer that question only by first articulating what the principles of justice are. One further example, concerned with the political constitution. We've kind of talked about this already, but Rawls would say that political constitutions distribute rights or liberties. Right. So let's compare two different political constitutions. We'll compare something like what we have, a representative democracy, with like an absolute monarchy, the kind of thing that Hobbes had in mind, right? Just an absolute monarchy. So in a representative democracy, you got a bunch of citizens running around, right? And whatever, they're all equally citizens. They're all doing their thing. Well, how would the constitution of a representative democracy distribute rights? Well, everyone equally has a right to vote, right? That's the kind of maybe the main political right that we all have. And everybody, all the citizens equally have it, right? And so we all have that. We're all given that right. That right is distributed to all of us. And so there's a considerable equality within a representative democracy. It's not total equality, however, with regard to political rights, because in a representative democracy, well, you're going to have representatives, right? Politicians. And they are given the right to vote just like us, right? They can go to the voting booth and vote for themselves or somebody else if they know how corrupt they are or whatever it might be. But they are, in addition, given the right to vote on legislation, to introduce bills and to vote on the bills and so on. And so in a sense, they have greater political rights than we have, right? Our Constitution determines those things, determines who has which political rights, right? It distributes rights in something like this manner, right? Something like that. By contrast, look at a monarchy. You have your subjects there. They do not have any political rights. They don't have the right to vote. They don't have the right to vote on legislation. They don't have any rights at all in an absolute monarchy. Instead, in an absolute monarchy, you got that guy over there who has all of the political rights. Yeah, that's Rawls's idea. That's the way in which a political constitution distributes rights. And again, Rawls's question, which of these distributions is just? Should we have a representative democracy? Should we have a monarchy? Should we have something else, a direct democracy? Should we have, which distribution of political rights is just? Again, Rawls is going to say we need to know what the principles of justice are. We need to determine them, and that's going to determine which major social institution we should have.